Bismillah. I want to talk in this podcast about unfolding events that are going on in Ukraine and the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what have you. In a sense, this podcast is sort of an addendum to the podcast that Eric Draitser has made and which I have posted on my wall. So I will link to that in the description box of this particular podcast. I want to add the following because I don't think that Eric made this abundantly clear. When we're talking about imperialism, we have to go back to Lenin himself and what he says about the nature of imperialism in that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. Now, the highest stage of capitalism, which is imperialism, doesn't necessarily mean that the elites that run the imperialist gambit and the high capitalist gambit are necessarily in accord with each other. They can be in accord with each other at certain stages, but usually they are at war. They are in an incessant competition for the spoils of the wealth of the planet amongst each other. And when these divisions and these conflicts, these rivalries become intense, is always when we witness war. This was the case in the Second World War, or the events that led to the Second World War, beginning with the rise of Hitler in Germany, and also in the post-war period as well. To some degree, this is the case. So, number one, those people who are lauding the events going on from the side of the Russians as being, the multipolarism and the new world, post-New World Order, post-unipolar order, are actually playing on one of the sides of the false dialectic. The conflict is not, the real conflict is not really between the Atlantic West and the Eurasian East, in which, you can include China in that configuration. The real conflict, from my point of view, is basically among the people of this planet, the average people of the planet, and the elites of this planet, against the elites of this planet, whether we're talking about the neoliberal wing of the Atlantic West or the Eurasianist wing of the East, which includes China and Russia. This needs to be taken aboard. Now, contrary to expectations, and this includes my own, Russia went ahead and made an invasion of Ukraine over the last 48 hours. First, they made that unilateral declaration of accepting the independence of the two breakaway republics of Lugansk and Donetsk in eastern Ukraine. These are the Russian majority areas of Ukraine. And then following on the heels of that, after the leadership of these two breakaway republics of the Ukraine called for it, there was an all-out invasion of the whole of Ukraine by Russian military forces under the edict of Vladimir Putin and his Duma, the Russian Congress. Now, although I am no friend to the Putinist regime, and I basically believe that this whole Eurasian multipolarist spiel to be a lot of hot air and baloney, the fact of the matter is that if we look at the trajectory of events since especially 2014, with the Euromaidan that overthrew the then president of Ukraine and replaced him with a compliant NATO lackey, the West, and particularly NATO forces, have been incessantly pushing and provoking the Russians. Now, whether this whole conflict is on the nature of the theatrical or not, which I believe ultimately it is, the fact of the matter is that on the surface level of events, the dialectics here clearly proves that NATO and the West has been incessantly provoking this conflict since that period. There are two agreements that were made between 2014 and 2015. These are known as the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements. I will put a link from the Wikipedia articles to that in the description box that people can appraise themselves of what these are. And throughout this process, although, yes, there is blame on both sides, it has actually been the Ukrainians in the West who have consistently violated agreements that have been undertaken between the Russian side and its proxies in Donetsk and Lugansk and the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians, and particularly those forces operating under the aegis of NATO and the Ukrainian military or neo-Nazis, have been consistently pushing and breaking and violating these accords with Russia. This was also one of the reasons that the Russians basically invaded and then annexed Crimea in that period of 2014, because basically it was the Americans and the NATO forces of Western Europe who were basically going for broke and trying to provoke the Russians and violate earlier agreements and undertakings that the Americans especially had made with the Russians after the end of the Cold War. And so this is the subtext to a lot of the behavior, the aggressive behavior of the Russians up to now, because, contrary to the undertakings made by Reagan, Bush 1, and Clinton, the Americans have consistently violated the undertakings that they made to the then leadership of Russia, whether it was Boris Yeltsin and then later Vladimir Putin, in not pushing NATO further and closer to Russian borders. This has actually happened. And what Euromaidan represented back in 2014 was on the economic level, on the economic bloc level, what NATO and the West has been doing that has basically ignited this conflict that has now witnessed the invasion of Russia of Ukraine. So people need to take these aboard, that the Americans and NATO and the Germans especially have provoked this conflict and brought it to their doorstep because of this ongoing Anglo-European versus Slav conflict that has its roots basically in the 19th century with the Russo-Turkish War, the Crimean War, etc., that continues to this very day in this present form. Now, as I have said many, many times, I am not a supporter of Russia. I am not a supporter of the Putinist regime. I do not look upon the Putinist regime as a continuation of the Soviet Union. In fact, Putin and the Russian leadership of today has made it abundantly clear that they are anti-communist, that they are revanchist Russian ultranationalists, and that they are basically pursuing a point of view and a policy not too dissimilar to the right-wingers that were active during the latter part of the Tsarist empire. And these were the Black Hundreds and the White Russians during the Russian Civil War, etc. So the Putinist regime is actually a reactionary neo-Tsarist regime. And so any leftists, and especially these tanky neo-Stalinists who continue to support Russia and the Putinist regime are, in my opinion, nothing more and nothing less than the useful idiots of the Russian regime. Be that as it may, we have an obligation to represent the facts accurately, and even in our speculations about certain issues, we must represent these matters with facts, or at least with cogent analysis that makes sense, and not fall into the traps that either the Atlanticists have fallen into or these Eurasianists have fallen into by basically lying to the public at large and misleading people and dragging one group of people into one camp or the other. That needs to stop. People need to be objective. People also need to realize that there have been protests that have exploded all over Russia at the moment, where a majority of the Russian people are not supporting the actions of their government against the Ukrainians and in the invasion of Ukraine. Be that as it may, as I have said, the Americans and NATO and the Western Europeans, and particularly the Germans, have brought matters to a head in the form that we have it today, beginning, I would say, in 2014, when with Euromaidan, it was actually U.S. aid and the National Endowment for Democracy. These are foundations that are under the aegis of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, that is responsible for spawning color revolutions. And these people were in the Euromaidan in 2014, and actually earlier than that in 2013. One of the first things that they did in Euromaidan was to push out all the leftists out of the crowd of protesters, and then packed Euromaidan with neo-Banderist, fascist, right-wing forces amongst the Ukrainian people. And after the events of Euromaidan, in the summer of 2014, these were the same fascist neo-Nazi Ukrainian forces that then perpetrated that massacre in Odessa, where they burnt people alive in buildings and whatnot. So these are facts that a lot of the punditry in the West especially is presently quite silent on, and they are not telling the public about. But it is alarming because, as we also know, that the Putinist regime itself is supporting and bankrolling a myriad of fascist, far-right, and neo-Nazi forces throughout Europe. Contrary to popular perceptions, and as I would recommend people to read, it would serve the interest of people to get a hold of the book of my friend Martin A. Lee, entitled The Beast Reawakens, because in that book, he details very meticulously with documentation and very good analysis how neo-Nazis, since the end of the Second World War, have been consistently used as proxies by both the Russians as well as the West. So, this ended somewhat after the end of the Cold War, but since 2014 especially, this has all come back again. So where you have the Russians supporting one group of fascists with the West supporting another group of fascists. And this is why I think it behooves those who are actually on the left to kind of take a step back and not support either the Russians or the Ukrainians or the West in this conflict. We are sandwiched in between two forces who are basically competing capitalism, so therefore competing imperialisms in that region. Both of them are in their own context authoritarian states and are pursuing their own financial and economic interests against everybody else. So anyone who is a real Marxist, who is a real leftist, needs to take a middle ground in this conflict and not support overtly one side or the other. Those who are supporting one side or the other, whether you're talking about those on the left in the West who are supporting NATO and the Western governments of the EU, are, in my opinion, chumps and are basically soft power forces of these powers. And by the same token, those of the tankies and neo-Stalinists on the left who are supporting the Russian government and the Russian regime in its actions against Ukraine are likewise useful idiots and chumps who are being used by these powers to advance the interests of one government or another. Real leftists need to stay the course in the middle ground against both of these, as far as I am concerned. And this is why, one of the reasons why I have been incessantly putting my finger on the point is that we need a third force on this planet, because this false dialectic between Eurasia and Atlantia is one that is pushing this planet to the brink of destruction. And it is these two particular forces of Eurasia Atlantia that basically need to be kicked out of the picture altogether. Whether we're talking about the unipolar Anglo-American Pax Americana or this nascent emerging Eurasianist authoritarian totalitarian world order that the people like Alexander Dugin and Putin have been pushing, and which the Chinese are also participant members. We need to stay away from either one of those false dialectics. What I want to say is that the issue about Ukraine, in my opinion, is basically the following. I believe that contrary to advice that should have been given to Vladimir Putin and the Russian leadership, that the Russian leadership has been carefully by the nose led into a quagmire that is Ukraine, right? They may succeed in temporarily subduing the Ukrainian military, but what Vladimir Putin has essentially committed himself to is the same mistake that Brezhnev and the Soviet leadership of 1979 committed itself to when they invaded Afghanistan in November 1979. And as we saw with that conflict, the Soviet Union got caught in a quagmire worse than the American one in Vietnam. And at the end of this process, especially just a year or two after Soviet forces withdrew from Afghanistan, we witnessed the complete implosion of the Soviet Union itself as a consequence of one of the consequences of its the quagmire that it had been involved with in Afghanistan. Because that quagmire in Afghanistan turned into a proxy war against the Soviet Union itself, where the Americans and the West and the Saudis and the Pakistanis basically marshaled Islamists against the Soviet Union, and very successfully, and basically brought the Soviet Union and its massive military to heel. This is going to happen again, in my opinion, and this was the mistake that Putin has made. Whether he has lost his nerve or whatnot is a question. So I see this as basically a trap that the West laid for the Russians, and the Russians walked right into. And as a consequence of this, and despite what a lot of these tankies and these pro-Putinists online may be telling you, at the tail end of this process, that this could happen tomorrow, this could happen a month from now, it could happen 2 years from now, it could happen 10 years from now. But at the tail end of this process, I foresee the fall of the Putinist regime itself as a consequence of this action of invading Ukraine. This was a mistake on the part of the Russian leadership. They could have stayed the course and basically played the West and the Europeans to exhaustion and gotten the same thing that they were after, guarantees for the security of Russia, etc. But it appears the Russian leadership has lost its nerve and for some reason has seen the circumstances as an opportunity, as an opening for them. So they have now gone into. Much of this has to do with the actions that the Biden administration took in Afghanistan last summer, where they withdrew American forces out of Afghanistan and essentially handed the country back to the Taliban. And this action by the Americans has projected massive weakness on the part of the Anglo-Americans. And so forces such as China and Russia look upon this as an opportunity because they believe that the Americans and their allies don't have the muscle anymore and the wherewithal to be able to stop them in whatever they want to do. Now, this creates a dangerous precedent because now that Russia has invaded Ukraine, this essentially gives a theoretical carte blanche to the Chinese to invade Taiwan. And if that should happen, then this conflict is going to have a wider scope. And there will be, just like World War II, a Pacific theater to a conflict, and a Pacific theater to a conflict that there is no way that the Americans and their allies in Asia or elsewhere are going to win. What this will do instead is going to push the entirety of Asia away from the Anglo-Americans, which in one level is a good thing, but into the embrace of the Chinese and their interests, which is not a good thing. Because China, for all of its pretensions of being the multipolar power and what is the Anglo-American economic power of the world, is itself a uber authoritarian and quite cynical power on the world stage. We have seen what they have done to Africa by stripping the resources of Africa down to nothing, completely, destroying entire environmental areas of Africa as a result of their mining and whatnot. So Chinese are not good guys, just like the Russians are not the good guys. Therefore, the Eurasianists are not the good guys, just as the Anglo-American Atlanticists are not the good guys. And this is one of the reasons, among many, that I have been incessantly pushing that we need a third force in this planet to stand against both the Atlantic West as well as the Eurasianist East. Because these two powers are, basically destroying this planet. And why? Because both of them represents the two heads, the two hydra heads of a single beast, which is the capitalist world order. Whereas the Anglo-Americans have pursued their neoliberal, Western model of capitalism. The Chinese and the Russians are pursuing another version of the same thing. And this is not any resolution. So that means the displacement of Anglo-America as the global power is not a resolution to the predicament that humanity finds itself in, but rather it is something far worse. And also, from my point of view, these sorts of conflicts are in some way also umbrellas and smokescreens by the plutocrats and oligarchs of the world to basically move capital around, right? So, whereas, yes, it is very possible that the Russians have been led by the nose into this quagmire, but, this sort of conflict also provides a cover, whether for the Anglo-American plutocrats or even for the Russian oligarchs to either diffuse their capital over the planet, okay, or move it from one place to another. In other words, there is a realignment on the economic level that is happening, and these wars and these sorts of conflicts are always providing the cover and the smokescreen to that end. So that is why, people who support one side or the other are actually supporting one capitalist power over another capitalist power. The history of this thing is long, and it goes back to probably about the 10th century. The issue of Ukraine itself is a very complicated one. The Russian civilization itself actually began in Kiev, which is now the capital of Ukraine, the Kiev and Rus civilization. Nevertheless, the Russians and the Ukrainian people are two distinct people. Even though their languages are very similar, nevertheless, the Ukrainians are Catholic, whereas the Russians are Eastern Orthodox. So there is that element of the conflict, the religious element of the conflict. But each of these two have also developed historically in their own trajectory. That doesn't mean that these people are not the same. At least for 72 years of the Soviet Union, they were exactly the same. They were, you had Soviet leadership that came from the Ukrainian. Nikita Khrushchev was a Ukrainian penultimate leader of the Soviet Union. But the fact is that since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the West has consistently exacerbated the situation, has gone back on agreements and undertakings that it has made with the Russian leadership, first with Boris Yeltsin, then with Vladimir Putin. And as of the conflict in 2014, beginning with Euromaidan, and then the fallout, and afterwards, the West has consistently violated its own undertakings to defuse this conflict. So whether the Russians saw their, no choice in the matter, that is open to speculation. But the fact of the matter is that, in my opinion, this conflict was literally brought on by the West itself. And the fact that the Russians have complied in the way that they have, in my opinion, actually is an indication of the weakness of the Putinist regime and Vladimir Putin specifically in undertaking this action. Because, like I said, they could have sat and played this forever, at least for another couple of years, and basically exhausted the West in its own gambit in Eastern Europe, right? And gotten to the same thing that they are after right now: security guarantees. This explosion, into a military conflict is not going to end well for the Russians, and I am predicting this. It is not going to end well for Vladimir Putin personally, or these Russian oligarchs that have rallied behind him since 1990, 1991. Hopefully, this will also be the epitaph. This conflict will be the epitaph of the far right in Europe itself. Nevertheless, the left needs to have its thinking caps about it and basically retreat from supporting either the Russians or the West, and regroup, because our conflict, the conflict of the left, is not with this ruling class or that ruling class. Our conflict is with the entire ruling classes of this planet, and it is not a conflict between the capitalists of the East and the capitalists of the West. Our conflict is with capitalism as a system from the North to the South poles. We wish the overthrow and the complete alignment of human society based on socialist principle, and from my point of view, green socialist principle. And neither the Russians or the Chinese or the Americans and their allies will ever provide that. So, multipolarism is a ruse, is a trap, in the same way that unipolarism of the Anglo-American world order has also been a ruse and a trap. Neither of these two forces are democratic in the true sense of the word. Neither of these two forces are offering a road to a better world for anybody. So it behooves the left to stop supporting either of these groups. And I'll leave it here. La hujja ila aliyan qabla nabiy.